The Supreme Court hearing room fell silent as Representative Jasmine Crockett walked confidently toward the witness table. The 42-year-old freshman Congresswoman from Texas wore a striking royal purple suit that stood out against the dark wood panels behind her. In the front row of the gallery sat Justice Clarence Thomas, his usually stoic face already showing signs of irritation. Just moments earlier, Thomas had given a rare public statement defending the court's ethics policies, claiming they were beyond reproach and that critics were simply playing politics. His comments had drawn approving nods from conservative supporters in the room, but Crockett, a former civil rights attorney with a reputation for fearlessness, carried a thick folder of documents as she approached the microphone. Her eyes locked briefly with Thomas's, and a slight smile crossed her lips. The longest-serving justice on the Supreme Court had no idea what was coming. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. It was about to become the moment that shook the Supreme Court to its core, leaving Thomas scrambling to defend himself as Crockett systematically dismantled decades of his carefully crafted image in front of the entire nation. Before we dive deeper into this incredible showdown, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more explosive political confrontations that the mainstream media won't show you. Justice Clarence Thomas was the embodiment of conservative judicial power in America. Appointed to the Supreme Court in 1991 under President George H.W. Bush, the 75-year-old justice had spent over 3 decades cementing his legacy as one of the most conservative voices on the bench. Known for his originalist interpretation of the Constitution and his frequent silence during oral arguments, Thomas had long been a polarizing figure. For years, Thomas had portrayed himself as a principled jurist above the political fray, often writing scathing opinions against what he viewed as government overreach. His supporters revered him as a constitutional purist who couldn't be swayed by public opinion or political pressure. But recent years had seen a growing cloud of ethics controversies surrounding Thomas. Reports about luxury trips funded by billionaire Republican donor Harlan Crow, private school tuition payments for a relative, and his wife Ginny Thomas's involvement in efforts to overturn the 2020 election had raised serious questions about his impartiality. Despite mounting evidence, Thomas had refused to recuse himself from cases related to these matters and had largely dismissed the concerns as partisan attacks. When called to testify before the House Judiciary Committee's special hearing on Supreme Court ethics, he had agreed only reluctantly, assuming his stature would shield him from serious challenge. Representative Jasmine Crockett was everything Thomas wasn't: young, progressive, and unafraid to speak truth to power. A rising Democratic star first elected to Congress in 2022, she had quickly made a name for herself with her sharp questioning and unwillingness to accept evasive answers. The former defense attorney and civil rights lawyer had spent her career fighting for voting rights and against systemic inequality. Growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, before building her legal career in Texas, Crockett knew what it meant to overcome obstacles. She had won her congressional seat by promising to bring accountability to powerful institutions, and she had made it her mission to address what she saw as corruption in the highest court of the land. The American people deserve answers, she had said in a CNN interview just days before. No one is above accountability in a democracy, especially not those with lifetime appointments to our highest court. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about Thomas or Crockett, it was about the very integrity of the Supreme Court itself. Public confidence in the court had fallen to historic lows, with only 25% of Americans expressing strong confidence in the institution, according to recent polls. Democrats had been pushing for a binding code of ethics for the Supreme Court, while Republicans had largely blocked these efforts, calling them politically motivated attacks. As the hearing room filled with journalists, legal scholars, and citizens, everyone knew this confrontation would either restore some faith in the court's integrity or expose deep-rooted problems that could no longer be ignored. The entire nation was watching, waiting to see if Thomas's decades of carefully cultivated authority could withstand Crockett's challenging questions. The committee chairman adjusted his microphone and addressed the room. Justice Thomas has graciously agreed to answer questions regarding the Supreme Court's ethics practices. Each member will have 5 minutes for questioning. He turned to the first row of representatives. Representative Crockett, you may begin. Crockett straightened the papers in front of her, her calm demeanor masking the intensity of what was about to unfold. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. She looked directly at Thomas. Justice Thomas, thank you for being here. Today, Thomas nodded slightly, his face a practiced mask of judicial impassivity. I'm here to defend the integrity of the court, Representative. Crockett smiled. That's exactly what I want to discuss. Justice Thomas, you've repeatedly stated that you follow the highest ethical standards. Is that correct? Yes, of course, Thomas replied confidently. All justices adhere to principles of judicial conduct that have guided the court for generations. The Congresswoman nodded, her expression unchanging. And you've stated that you believe financial disclosures and recusal standards are sufficient as they currently exist. Thomas leaned toward his microphone. The court has internal procedures that have served us well. We consult with each other on ethical matters and make independent judgments about recusal. The system has preserved the court's independence for centuries. Crockett nodded again, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. So you believe the existing disclosure requirements are adequate? I do, Thomas answered firmly. We follow the law. The room remained quiet, almost tense, as Crockett opened the folder in front of her. Justice Thomas, I have here your financial disclosure forms from 2019. She held up a document. Can you confirm this is your signature? Thomas squinted slightly. Yes, that appears to be my signature. And in this disclosure, did you report any gifts or reimbursements from your friend Harlan Crow? A flicker of discomfort crossed Thomas's face. I believe I reported everything required by law. Crockett's voice remained measured. That wasn't my question, Justice Thomas. Did you report the private jet flights, yacht vacations, or the real estate transactions with Mr. Crow on this form? The room grew still. Thomas shifted in his seat. Representative, those were personal hospitality from a friend, which, under the rules at that time... So that's a no, Crockett interjected firmly. You did not report them. Thomas's jaw tightened visibly. The rules for personal hospitality were unclear. Crockett reached for another document. Justice Thomas, here I have a memo from 2012 sent to all federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, clarifying that private jet travel and yacht stays must be reported regardless of personal friendship. Did you receive this memo? Thomas's composure began to crack slightly. I don't recall every memo. Let me help you with your memory, Justice Thomas, Crockett said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. She signaled to an aide who displayed a large photograph on the screen behind her. The image showed Thomas boarding a private jet with Harlan Crow. This was taken in 2018. Would you like to explain why this trip wasn't disclosed as required? Murmurs spread through the hearing room. Thomas's eyes narrowed and his grip on the edge of the table tightened. Representative, I believe you're mischaracterizing. Crockett didn't let him finish. I'm not characterizing anything, Justice Thomas. I'm showing evidence. She displayed another photo, this time of Thomas on Crow's yacht. This was 2019. Also not disclosed. Thomas's face flushed with anger. These were personal trips with a man who has filed amicus briefs in cases before your court, Crockett cut in, a man with direct financial interests in matters you've ruled on. The tension in the room was palpable now. Thomas glanced at his lawyer, who looked increasingly concerned. Crockett continued, her pace quickening. Justice Thomas, you've cast the deciding vote in multiple cases where Mr. Crow had significant financial interests, including the 2022 EPA regulatory decision that directly benefited his real estate holdings. Did you consider recusing yourself? I make my recusal decisions based on the law and my conscience, Thomas replied, his voice rising slightly. Not based on who I know socially. Crockett pressed on. Let's move to another matter. Your disclosure forms also failed to mention that Harlan Crow paid over $100,000, 0 cents, for your grandnephew's private school tuition. Do you consider educational expenses for family members to be personal hospitality as well? A ripple of reaction spread through the audience. Thomas's lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but Thomas waved him off, his frustration now evident. Those arrangements were private family matters, Thomas insisted, his voice taking on a defensive edge. Private family matters paid for by a billionaire with business before your court, Crockett corrected. The law requires disclosure of such gifts, Justice Thomas, the chairman interrupted. Representative Crockett, your time. I still have 2 minutes, Mr. Chairman, Crockett said firmly, and I intend to use them. She turned back to Thomas, whose composure was visibly fraying. "Justice Thomas, let's discuss your wife's activities. In 2020 and 2021, Ginny Thomas sent multiple text messages to Trump's chief of staff, advocating for overturning the election results. Did you disclose these conflicts when cases related to the 2020 election came before you?" Thomas's face darkened. "My wife's activities are her own. I do not discuss court matters with her." Crockett raised an eyebrow. "So you're telling this committee that you never discussed the 2020 election with your wife, even as she was sending dozens of messages calling it the greatest heist of our history?" "My wife has her own career and opinions," Thomas responded, his voice now clearly agitated. "I make my decisions based on the Constitution and the law." "Yet you were the lone dissenter in the case seeking to block the January 6th committee from accessing White House records," Crockett pointed out. "Records that might have contained communications involving your wife." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Thomas's lawyer again tried to intervene, but Thomas leaned forward, his voice rising. "This is exactly the kind of partisan attack that undermines the court's legitimacy." Crockett remained composed, which seemed to frustrate Thomas even more. "Justice Thomas, asking for basic ethical compliance isn't a partisan attack. It's what we require from every federal employee, from interns to cabinet secretaries. Why should the Supreme Court be different?" Before Thomas could respond, the chairman's gavel came down. "The representative's time has expired. Justice Thomas, would you like to respond to the last question?" Thomas's face was a storm of barely controlled anger as he looked at Crockett. The exchange was far from over. "Yes, I would like to respond," Thomas said, his voice tight with restrained fury. "Representative Crockett seems determined to paint a false picture of my service on the court. These so-called ethics concerns are nothing but a smokescreen for those who disagree with my judicial philosophy." Crockett's face remained impassive, her eyes never leaving Thomas as he continued. "I have served on this court for 32 years with integrity. I don't make decisions based on who I know or what my wife does. I make them based on my understanding of the Constitution as written." The chairman nodded. "Thank you, Justice Thomas." "We'll now move to point of parliamentary procedure," Crockett interrupted, raising her hand. "Justice Thomas made claims about my questioning that I should be allowed to address." The chairman hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "1 minute, Representative." Crockett turned back to Thomas, her expression resolute. "Justice Thomas, this isn't about your judicial philosophy. This is about transparency and accountability." She held up another document. "I'd like to enter into the record this previously unreleased email from Harlan Crow to you dated June 12, 2018. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. His lawyer immediately leaned forward with concern. Crockett continued, her voice clear and deliberate. "In this email, Mr. Crow writes, and I quote, 'Clarence, I'm pleased the EPA matter is coming before the court. My team has prepared some thoughts that might be useful to you. I've attached them here rather than filing an official brief to avoid any unnecessary attention.'" A collective gasp rippled through the hearing room. Reporters began frantically typing on their phones. Thomas's face drained of color. "I've never seen that email," Thomas said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. Crockett didn't miss a beat. "It was sent to your personal email, Justice Thomas. The same email address you used to coordinate your trips on Mr. Crow's yacht." She slid a copy of the email across the table toward him. "Your response was, 'Thanks, H. We'll look it over this weekend.'" Thomas stared at the paper, visibly shocked that Crockett had access to these private communications. "Representative, this is taken out of context," Thomas stammered, his carefully cultivated judicial demeanor crumbling before the entire room. "Mr. Crow sends me many things. I don't necessarily read them all." Crockett raised an eyebrow. "So you're confirming the email is authentic?" Thomas realized his mistake too late. I would need to check my records. I receive many emails." "Justice Thomas," Crockett said, her voice quieter but somehow more powerful for it. "The American people deserve to know if a Supreme Court justice is receiving private legal arguments from billionaire benefactors with cases before the court. Don't you agree?" Thomas's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Thomas was beyond restraint now. His face contorted with anger as he slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! he shouted, startling everyone in the room. "This is nothing but character assassination. You come in here with cherry-picked messages and photos trying to destroy my reputation. This is exactly why good people don't want to serve in government." The outburst stunned the hearing room into silence. The chairman fumbled for his gavel as Thomas continued, his voice rising. 32 years. I've given this country 32 years on the highest court, enduring attacks and slander, and this is the thanks I get? A show trial orchestrated by people who've never read the Constitution? Crockett remained perfectly composed, which seemed to infuriate Thomas even more. "Justice Thomas," she said calmly, "no one is questioning your intelligence or your years of service. We're simply asking why you feel the rules that apply to every other federal judge somehow don't apply to you." Thomas's voice rose even higher. "Because these aren't about rules. This is about delegitimizing the court because you don't like our decisions." Crockett shook her head slightly. "No, Justice Thomas. This is about whether the American people can trust that their highest court isn't compromised by undisclosed gifts and conflicts of interest." She turned to address the committee. "Mr. Chairman, I would like to introduce one final piece of evidence." The chairman, still recovering from Thomas's outburst, nodded numbly. Crockett held up a final document. "This is a bank statement showing that Justice Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, received a payment of $80,000 0 from a dark money group called Americans for Liberty on March 15, 2022. 2 weeks later, Justice Thomas cast the deciding vote in a case that blocked the disclosure requirements for exactly this type of political group. She looked directly at Thomas. "Justice Thomas, did you disclose this conflict of interest to your colleagues? Did you consider recusal?" Thomas's face had gone from angry red to ashen. He looked like a man who suddenly realized he was standing on thin ice that was cracking beneath him. I don't manage my wife's finances," he said weakly. "That wasn't my question," Crockett replied. "Did you know about this payment when you voted on that case?" The silence in the room was deafening. Thomas's lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but Thomas seemed beyond listening. His hands trembled slightly. "This hearing is an ambush," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I was invited here under false pretenses." Crockett shook her head slightly. "You were invited here to discuss Supreme Court ethics, Justice Thomas. That's exactly what we're doing." Thomas looked around the room, seemingly searching for allies, but found only shocked faces and the relentless lenses of cameras capturing his meltdown for the world to see. "I refuse to participate in this character assassination any further," he declared, abruptly standing up. "This committee has no constitutional authority over the Supreme Court." As Thomas started to gather his papers, Crockett delivered her final blow. "Justice Thomas, I have one last question. If you truly believe you've done nothing wrong, why are you refusing to answer these basic questions about compliance with ethical standards that every other federal judge must follow?" Thomas froze, papers clutched in his hands. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing a mixture of rage and something else. Fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that his carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time before the American public. "This hearing is adjourned," he growled, despite having no authority to make such a declaration. The chairman quickly intervened. "Justice Thomas, only the chair can adjourn this hearing. Please sit down." But Thomas was already moving toward the exit, his lawyer hurrying behind him, trying to whisper in his ear. The image of the longest-serving Supreme Court justice storming out of a congressional hearing was unprecedented and devastating to whatever remained of his reputation for judicial temperament. As Thomas reached the door, Crockett's calm voice carried across the silent room. "The American people will draw their own conclusions from your refusal to answer, Justice Thomas." Thomas paused at the door, turned back with a glare of pure fury, then pushed through and disappeared from view. The hearing room erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories. Committee members turned to each other in shock, and at the center of it all sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, calmly organizing her documents. The picture of composure after having systematically dismantled one of the most powerful men in America. The chairman, still trying to process what had just happened, leaned toward his microphone. "The committee will take a 15-minute recess." But it was too late for a recess. The damage was done. In less than 20 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had accomplished what decades of critics had failed to do. She had exposed the ethical compromises of Justice Clarence Thomas in a way that no one could ignore, and she had done it with nothing but his own words, actions, and documents. As Crockett finally looked up from her notes, she caught the eye of a veteran civil rights attorney sitting in the gallery. The older woman gave her a subtle nod of approval, a torch being passed to a new generation. Crockett nodded back, her mission accomplished. The hearing room had barely emptied before the clips of Thomas's meltdown began spreading across social media like wildfire. The moment he slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "Enough!" instantly became the most shared video in America, with Thomas meltdown and Crockett takedown trending simultaneously on every platform. CNN cut into their regular programming with breaking news banners. Justice Thomas storms out of ethics hearing after confrontation with Rep. Crockett. MSNBC's Chiron was even more direct. Supreme crisis. Thomas explodes when questioned about hidden emails and undisclosed gifts. Fox News initially tried a different angle. Democrat Congresswoman ambushes Justice Thomas with misleading questions. But even their legal analysts couldn't defend Thomas's behavior, with one commentator reluctantly admitting on air, regardless of the substance, storming out of a congressional hearing is unprecedented for a sitting justice. This is not a good look for the court. Outside the Capitol, reporters swarmed around Crockett as she calmly made her way down the steps, microphones thrust toward her from every direction. "Representative Crockett, did you expect Justice Thomas to react that way?" A CNN reporter called out. Crockett paused, composed as ever. This wasn't about provoking a reaction. This was about transparency and accountability. The American people deserve a Supreme Court they can trust. "Where did you get those emails?" shouted a reporter from the Washington Post. "All the documents presented today were obtained legally through proper channels," Crockett replied. "What should concern Americans is not how we got them, but what they reveal about the ethical standards, or lack thereof, at our highest court." As Crockett continued down the steps, her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket. Text messages from colleagues, calls from Democratic leadership, and notifications of thousands of new followers on her social media accounts poured in. In the span of 20 minutes, she had transformed from a promising freshman representative to a national figure, the woman who had stood up to Clarence Thomas and won. Back at the Supreme Court, the mood was grim. Thomas had been whisked away in a black SUV with tinted windows, refusing to speak to reporters shouting questions. Inside the court's hallowed halls, the other 8 justices were rapidly gathering for an emergency meeting, something that virtually never happened outside of their regular conference schedule. Chief Justice Roberts had called the meeting after watching the hearing unfold on television, his usual measured expression replaced by deep concern. As the justices filed into their conference room, the divisions were evident. The court's liberal members looked disturbed, while some conservatives appeared defensive. All of them, however, recognized the institutional crisis unfolding before them. "I've spoken briefly with Justice Thomas," Roberts began once they were all seated. He is collecting himself, "but we need to address this immediately. The integrity of the court is at stake." Justice Sonia Sotomayor was the first to speak. "John, we've been talking about adopting a formal code of ethics for years. Today shows why we can't delay any longer." "I agree," Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson added. "Representative Crockett raised legitimate questions that demand answers. If we don't provide them, Congress will keep digging, and they should." The conservative justices exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who typically allied with Thomas seemed shaken by his behavior. "Whatever the merits of the questions," Justice Brett Kavanaugh said carefully, "storming out of a congressional hearing undermines our standing as an institution." Justice Samuel Alito, Thomas's closest ally on the court, attempted a defense. "Clarence was ambushed with private communications taken out of context. Anyone would be upset." "That may be," Justice Elena Kagan countered, "but the underlying issues remain." Harlan Crow's email about the EPA case is deeply troubling, regardless of context. And the timing of Ginny Thomas's payment from a group with business before us, we can't just ignore these things. Roberts sighed heavily. "We need to issue a statement. And more importantly, we need to adopt a binding code of ethics immediately, one with real teeth. Otherwise, Congress may try to impose one on us." The discussion continued behind closed doors, but word of the emergency meeting leaked almost immediately. Legal analysts on every network speculated about the potential for an unprecedented internal censure of Thomas, or even calls for his resignation. Meanwhile, at the White House, the president had been watching the hearing with his senior advisors. The political implications were enormous. A discredited Supreme Court justice could shift the balance of power on countless upcoming decisions. "Get me Representative Crockett on the phone," the president told his chief of staff, "and prepare a statement emphasizing the importance of judicial ethics without directly attacking Justice Thomas." The careful wording reflected the delicate balance required. While many in the administration were privately delighted by Thomas's meltdown, openly celebrating would appear partisan and undermine the fundamental issue of court integrity. Across Washington, reaction was breaking down along predictable partisan lines, with notable exceptions. Most Republicans were rushing to Thomas's defense, calling the hearing a setup and a witch hunt. Senator Ted Cruz tweeted, "The left will stop at nothing to destroy conservative justices who follow the Constitution." This disgraceful ambush proves it. But a few conservative voices broke ranks. Former federal judge J. Michael Luttig, a respected conservative jurist, tweeted, "No judge is above ethical standards. Justice Thomas's behavior today was beneath the dignity of the court and raises serious questions that must be answered." Even more surprisingly, George Conway, conservative attorney and critic of Donald Trump, wrote a blistering thread. "I've argued before the Supreme Court 9 times and clerked for a federal judge. What we saw today was indefensible. A justice receiving private legal arguments from a billionaire benefactor who's paid for luxury trips, then voting on cases affecting that benefactor's interests. This isn't liberal versus conservative. It's right versus wrong." The evening news broadcasts led with nothing else. Every network played the clips of Thomas shouting, "Enough!" and storming out of the hearing room on a loop. Side-by-side images showed Thomas's usual stoic demeanor on the bench, contrasted with his rage-contorted face. As Crockett calmly questioned him, ABC News aired an interview with a former Thomas clerk who reluctantly admitted, "I respect Justice Thomas enormously, but I can't defend what we saw today. Judges must be held to the highest ethical standards, and transparency about conflicts is fundamental to our system." By nightfall, the political earthquake had grown even larger. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, long a critic of Supreme Court ethics issues, announced he would introduce legislation to impose a binding code of conduct on the court, and he claimed to have the votes to pass it. More dramatically, Congressman Jerry Nadler, ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, held a hastily arranged press conference to announce he was introducing articles of impeachment against Thomas. "What we witnessed today goes beyond ethical lapses," Nadler declared. "Justice Thomas appears to have violated federal law by failing to disclose gifts and by participating in cases where he had clear conflicts of interest. If these allegations are proven true, they constitute impeachable offenses." While impeachment remained unlikely given the political makeup of Congress, the mere fact that it was being seriously discussed showed how dramatically the ground had shifted in a single day. As darkness fell over Washington, the main players in the day's drama were processing what had happened in very different ways. Justice Thomas had retreated to his home in Virginia, refusing all calls except from his wife. Sources close to Thomas said he was furious and feels betrayed by colleagues who weren't rallying more strongly to his defense. There were whispers that he was considering retiring rather than face further humiliation, though those close to him insisted he would never give his critics the satisfaction. Chief Justice Roberts was working late into the night with court staff to draft both a statement and a proposed code of ethics that might salvage the court's rapidly deteriorating reputation. His impossible task was to find language that acknowledged the seriousness of the allegations without throwing Thomas completely under the bus. And Representative Jasmine Crockett, she returned to her office to find it overflowing with flowers and notes of support from constituents, civil rights organizations, and even a few anonymous messages from Supreme Court clerks. Her phone continued to buzz with interview requests and congratulatory messages from Democratic leaders, but Crockett wasn't celebrating. When her chief of staff found her, she was sitting at her desk reviewing a thick stack of documents, evidence she hadn't even needed to use at the hearing. "You should go home and rest," her chief of staff advised. "You've earned it." Crockett shook her head. determined as ever. "This isn't about one justice or one hearing," she said. "This is about making sure the highest court in our land actually delivers equal justice under law, and we're just getting started." As night fell on Washington, political analysts were already calling it one of the most consequential congressional hearings in modern history. The supreme confidence that had defined Clarence Thomas for decades had been shattered in minutes by a freshman Congresswoman who came prepared with facts he couldn't deny and questions he couldn't answer. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain: the Supreme Court would never be quite the same. The myth of the justices as being above accountability had been irreparably damaged, not by partisan attacks, but by the simple, devastating power of evidence presented calmly in the light of day. And it had all started with a question that couldn't be dodged or deflected. "Justice Thomas, why do you feel the rules that apply to every other federal judge somehow don't apply to you?" It was a question that would echo through the halls of power for months to come. The morning after the explosive hearing, as Washington was still reeling from the unprecedented confrontation, "Thomas must resign" became the top trending hashtag nationwide, with millions of posts demanding accountability. Legal experts across the political spectrum appeared on morning shows debating the implications for Supreme Court legitimacy and whether ethical reforms were now inevitable. By noon, a coalition of 80 law professors had signed an open letter calling for Thomas to recuse himself from all cases involving issues where he had undisclosed conflicts. More dramatically, a group of 200 federal judges, something almost unheard of, released a statement expressing grave concern about the integrity of our judicial system and calling for immediate adoption of a binding ethics code for the Supreme Court. For Jasmine Crockett, the woman at the center of this political earthquake, the hearing wasn't about personal glory, but about fundamental fairness. As she told reporters gathering outside her office, "This isn't about politics. It's about making sure that in America, no one, not even a Supreme Court justice, is above the law." The confrontation between Crockett and Thomas had become more than a viral moment. It was now a pivotal point in American judicial history, forcing a reckoning with questions of power, accountability, and what it truly means for justice to be blind. If you thought this showdown was intense, you won't want to miss our upcoming videos on other powerful confrontations reshaping American politics. Hit the like button and subscribe now to make sure you never miss another breaking political moment.